Hi everybody. This first PowerPoint deck describes the relationship between the fund financial statements and the government-wide financial statements and the differences between the two. Remember, the fund financial statements and the government-wide financial statements are two duplicate sets of financial statements that report on the same activities. There are three types of funds: the governmental funds, the proprietary funds, and the fiduciary funds. Within the governmental funds, there are the general fund, the special revenue funds, debt service funds, the capital projects funds, and the permanent funds. Within the proprietary funds, there are the internal service funds and the enterprise funds, and within the fiduciary funds, there are the agency funds and the trust funds. Make sure you go back and remember the differences between the different types of funds and when it is appropriate to use each. As you can tell from the chart, the governmental funds are accounted for on a modified accrual basis. The proprietary funds and the fiduciary funds are accounted for on an accrual basis. And the government-wide financial statements, which are divided into the governmental activities and the business type activities, are also reported on an accrual basis. Recall that the governmental funds and the internal service funds combine and roll up to form the governmental activities. You could think of the governmental activities as a super fund, if that's an easy way to think about it. And the enterprise funds combine and roll up to form the business type activities. The fiduciary funds are not reported within the government-wide financial statements. The purpose of the government-wide financial statements is to give a picture of the government as a whole. The resources in the fiduciary funds don't belong to the government. They represent assets that the government is holding on behalf of others. Now, generally, because they are duplicate sets of financial statements, most transactions that affect the general government, meaning the non-business type activities, so those that are accounted for within the governmental funds and the internal service funds, require entries in both the governmental activities and the appropriate governmental fund or internal service funds. So most times you should find yourself, when faced with a transaction that's affecting the general government, you should find yourself making an entry in both the appropriate fund and in the governmental activities. There are some exceptions, however. The following events generally require entries in the governmental funds, but not in the governmental activities. Okay, so first, all the entries involving the budgetary accounts, recording the budget, amending the budget, closing the budgetary accounts, so estimated revenues and appropriations. We don't record the budget in the governmental activities, so we would make those entries only in the appropriate governmental fund. Anything to do with recording encumbrances or reversing encumbrances, we would not make that entry in the governmental activities, again, because we don't record the budget or any of the budget entries or encumbrances in the governmental activities. Transfers or transactions between two governmental funds, or transfers or transactions between a governmental fund and an internal service funds, also generally are not recorded in the governmental activities because those transactions are all within the governmental activities and therefore don't affect it. There are also some events which require entries in the governmental activities, but not in the governmental funds. For the most part, these have to do with capital assets and long-term debt. So first, the transfer of capital assets from work in progress to completed construction occurs only in the governmental activities, not in the funds. The disposal of a capital asset without the receipt or payment of cash or another current asset also would affect the governmental activities, but not the governmental fund. Recognition of depreciation or amortization. Again, because this addresses capital assets, and capital assets are not recognized in the fund financial statements, we would generally not record them in the governmental funds. Amortization of bond premium or discount, similar concept. Accrual of interest expense, we don't recognize interest expenditure in the governmental funds until it's payable and due, while in the governmental activities we do accrue interest expense as of the end of the financial reporting period. And then the receipt of a capital asset as a donation, since there are no current assets involved, would not be recorded in the governmental funds, but would be recorded in the governmental activities. So just as a reminder, the following accounts are never used in the governmental funds: capital assets, land, buildings, depreciation, long-term debt, bonds payable. If you're working in the general fund or another governmental fund and you find yourself using one of these accounts, start over. Second thing to remember is there are never any transfers between a fund and the governmental activities or between a fund and the business type activities. So don't be tempted to make any entries like that. Transfers are only between funds, so a transfer from one fund to another, or between the governmental activities and the business type activities. So a transfer would be from the governmental activities to business type activities, or in reverse. I hope this helps. There are 3 other decks out there for you to look at to help you review for the midterm.